What is the response that should be expected as Ace Magashule supporters are really gearing up to shut down the country, because they're really unhappy with Magashule being targeted, as they say?
Thank you. Lovely to be on your show. I think that the reports of this faction, the so-called RET force, shutting down the nation are wildly exaggerated. I don't think they have the capacity or necessarily the will. I think what we're going to see rather is the Secretary General challenging this step down legally, because actually the step down clause and action is in violation of the South African Constitution. So I think the Secretary General of the ANC has legal recourse by evoking the clauses of the Constitution, which speak about a presumption of innocence before guilt. But what the step-aside clause does, it reverses that logic. And the ANC Constitution is subservient to the country's Constitution. So I think we're going to see a legal battle rather than a battle in the streets. That's my prediction. I think the RET forces have been villainized, and they're seen as these people unruly, taking South Africa by storm and causing chaos. I personally don't see that happening at all.
Now, Kim, let's talk to that violation of the South African Constitution. Obviously, Ace Magashule will be well aware of this, and so will his legal representatives if he does decide to challenge this in court. The ANC should have had foresight, at least to know that this is a possibility, and if they did, why then institute the step-aside clause?
I think they're desperate, particularly the president is desperate to show that he can stand up against his so-called opponents within the party, which is an absurd situation, because one of the resolutions taken at Nasrec in 2017 was organizational renewal and unity. But what we've seen is a divided organization more and more, with the president having very little control over the executive that is meant to be reporting to him. So I think that this 30-day clause was a little bit of a compromise between the two so-called factions, with no one really actually winning. There's a bit of a stalemate. So I think he's exercising that right, but I don't think it's going to end in a win for either, actually. I think the president's weakened. I think so too is the so-called RET factor. But in the end, it's the ANC itself that's compromised. And as the great leader Oliver Tambo said, the only thing that can destroy the ANC is the ANC itself. And we're seeing that in force today, actually.
As Magashule was speaking at a party event honoring liberation struggle hero Charlotte Maxeke, he had a lot to say. I mean, he spoke about how the ANC is deeply divided and it's up to the structures to decide if they want to defend him or not. And he says that he's yet to decide if he will step aside at the end of the month. He also, one interesting aspect, he spoke to how he'll be busy, consulting with former party leaders over his future this weekend, mentioning how he's scheduling meetings with former presidents Thabo Mbeki and Kgalema Motlanthe. Of course, now this really speaks to the chaos that could unfold behind the scenes ahead of D-Day.
Absolutely. And I think actually I like how you phrased that question, and I almost think that these conversational consultative drapes are actually artificial. I think it's a guise, because I think decisions have been made and we know where a lot of these former presidents stand. I think they want the SG out. And my view is actually quite simple. If he's guilty of a crime, he must account for it like any other South African. But we have to ask very hard questions, which we as South Africans sometimes don't do. And that is, are our legal courts and our judicial chambers being used for justice? Or are they being used for pure political reasons? And I think that's the chaos we're speaking about. We're actually putting our justice system in a crisis. We're setting a very dangerous precedent for times to come. to oust one or two opponents. And perhaps we should swing this whole debate on its head and say, maybe it's the NEC itself that should step aside rather than the SG, because the NEC is meant to be representing the branches. But what have they done since 2017? Not one single resolution has been put in place. So the SG also has an option to implore the branches to recall the NEC, and that may be a very interesting option.
Talk to us about, the scenarios that could play out, worst case and best case scenario for the ANC, in particular the NEC.
Well, I don't know that there is a best case scenario, and I don't see this as a win situation for anybody. And most tragically, it's not a win situation for the people of South Africa, the ordinary black person who's struggling. And whether the 30 days ends with the recall of the SG or not, or other people, it's not going to make any material difference in the life of an ordinary South African. And I do believe that in a way, this whole 30-day call and these matters, and now we see these new civil rights groups emerging, version 2 of Save South Africa. The whole concern and orientation in this country at the moment is on the step aside, the one or two potential corrupt people. But it's distracting from real issues. This ongoing pandemic of poverty that isn't being dealt with, the pandemic of unemployment, the fact that the president has achieved very little since he's come into power. I mean, these are issues that I think are deliberately being distracted from. And I think that's where we should cast our eyes, because when justice falls and the truth falls, no one wins. And I think that's what we're in. We're in a situation where we don't know what the truth is anymore. To penalize and crucify a number of people to show an individual's strength isn't actually an act of strength. It's an act of weakness. And in the meantime, ordinary South Africans are suffering, and that's a real tragedy.
Kim, where does this then now place the South Africans you speak of, who are really bearing the grunt of perhaps the behavior and the wrongdoings of powerful political heads? I mean, the step-aside rule surely was, meant to show that President Cyril Ramaphosa is doing something about corruption, which is something that South Africans are really concerned about, because the ripple effect just trickles down and the impact is felt on people's day-to-day lives.
Yes, I agree. And corruption is one of the pandemics we face. But we cannot isolate that as if it's the signature tune of a few people in the organization, like Ace or others. I mean, the president himself is sealing records around a possible corruption charge. There are white companies who aren't being dealt with at all on the Zondo Commission because they're refusing to make an appearance. So if we speak about corruption, let's speak about it consistently and look at the real culprits. Collectively, I'm not exempting anyone from that examination, but I'm saying let's take a holistic look. It's easy to condemn one or two individuals. And corruption is it's not the only pandemic. The pandemic is dealing with the structural inequality that we see. And to me, that's a real pandemic in this country that is killing people every day. It's far more than COVID, far more than corruption. I mean, corruption in itself is shocking. I write that it's actually treason against ordinary people, but it's one of the ills that we face. And it's not done by a handful of people. It's done by a lot of people that we ignore. I mean, white monopoly capital, and I hope I'm allowed to say that word on your channel, is almost exempt from being seen as corrupt. And yet if we look at what's happening, they are the main culprits. But we don't want to hear those things.
Kim, let's just, if you can, unpack this a little bit for me. So, besides the fact that you've mentioned that there's a violation of the Constitution, the South African Constitution, when it comes to the step-aside rule, but it seems like Ace Magashule has a trump card. The way he's just going on, it doesn't really seem to be about to heed to anyone's call as he goes about his business. What could that trump card be?
Well, I think where the SG has a little bit of power is, and more so than the president, is that I think on the ground he has a lot of support, actually. And I think we see that at recent hearings. We see he's been swamped with crowds. He didn't address them because of COVID regulations. But we don't see the same type of ground support for the president himself or many of his ministers. So I do believe that he's got a lot of supporters on the ground. I think a lot of what he says resonates with ordinary people. And I think there's an antagonism across ANC branches that the NEC and the new president have totally ignored their views. In fact, it's as if the ANC these days doesn't even account to the ANC branch. So you have to say, who is the president and this administration catering to and listening to? Who is their branch? Because it's certainly not the people within the ANC. And that is what Ace has on his side. I do believe he has the support of branches who are disgruntled because every single objective that they spoke about in every single resolution has been totally ignored by Ramaphosa and his administration.
What would this now mean and translate to? Should we now reach, I mean, we're on day 18 of 30, once we get right to the end, and it's D-Day, what will the impact be on President Cyril Ramaphosa's power and positioning, depending on whichever way this sways?
I think he's weakened, and there's a lot of talk about him showing his strength now by taking on the SG and you know, even if he wins and Ace steps down or is suspended, I don't think Ramaphosa's won because he's dealing with a more fragmented ANC. And actually, I think both factions, to me, are a total disgrace in the ANC. And if we look back today at who I call a true leader of the ANC, Chris Hani, you know, he spoke about being careful of the time when our leaders become so obsessed with material well-being, more so than for the ordinary people. And I think in both sides, across the ANC, across the factions, there's this absolute dedication to self-enrichment and personal well-being rather than that of the people. So my prognosis is negative. I think we have an ANC that is almost social distancing itself from its own people. And that is going to put it in a crisis. Whether Ace goes or not is not that material. The state of the ANC is one of crisis. It's out of touch with ordinary people. It doesn't take its mandate from its branch. And I think we're going to see the slow decline of this party. And perhaps voters come election day need to say the ANC itself needs to step down.
Kim Heller, thank you so much for your time this morning. We really do appreciate it. She is a writer and political analyst, as is day 12 of 30 in that step aside D-Day that we're waiting for to see what the outcome will be. As she says, the state of the ANC slowly but surely declining.